So hello to everybody. I'm really happy to be here. The topic is really very interesting because I think that the hypofractionation is a future of radiation therapy. And we see it also here during this Congress, which is even called like Green Radiotherapy Congress. So we go green also here in this symposium. I'm really happy to have two distinguished lectures, Dr. Leonardi and Professor Nicolas Van As. So Dr. Leonardi, Maria Cristina Leonardi, a colleague and a friend of mine working with in my department. She's a deputy director working in the division of radiation therapy at the European Institute of Oncology in Milan, Italy. Cristina Leonardi is involved in the activities on IMRT, hypofractionation, PBI, irradiation and re-irradiation, and she is involved in numerous clinical studies about breast and GI cancer. She is the author of more than 120 papers and 9 book chapters, and she is one of the key opinion leader in hypofractionation in breast cancer. So we'll be happy to host her here for the presentation. And then Professor Nicolas Van As, well known, I think, for the majority of us, is a medical director of the Royal Marsden NHS Foundation Trust and is the hospital's clinical lead for SBRT and CyberKnife. His main research interests are in stereotactic and image-guided radiotherapy, risk prediction in early prostate cancer, and functional MRI, and he has published numerous papers on these subjects and delivered presentations at international meetings. He's the chief investigator for the PACE trial, an international randomized controlled trial comparing SBRT to image-guided radiotherapy and surgery for treating prostate cancer. So again, very welcome to our speakers. We thought to organize the session since the topic is really very busy, both hypofractionation in prostate and in breast, there are many data. So we have first polling just to see what you are doing in your routine practice. Then we will have 2 presentations and then the discussion at the end with both speakers here. Okay, so this is the way we want to arrange the session. So we have the polling now.
Okay, so we're going to begin with the polling. And again, you have the instructions here. And so we'd like to start with the first question. So please get out your smartphones and click on the ESTRO app, again, industries, the symposium, and look at questions. And so the first question is going to be, for the majority of patients with early breast cancer, what is the best current method of delivering adjuvant radiation therapy? Choice 1 is moderate hypofractionation. Choice 2 is 5-fraction whole breast radiation. Choice 3 is 5-fraction partial breast irradiation, or PBI. And so we'll give a few moments.
We see people voting, so it's going ahead, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And we'll ask our speakers to pay attention to how the audience is voting, because it might add some interesting conversation for our conclusion. So I'll just give 5 to 10 more seconds. That's okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And we see,
We'll bring
I don't know how many people are in the room, but already more than 50 voted.
So lots of votes coming in. And we'll display the results just so you could see also. So here are the results right now. You could see number 1, moderate hypofractionation has the most, then 5-fraction whole breast, and then 5-fraction partial breast irradiation. We'll go to the next question. For the previous question, in 3 to 5 years, and based on extrapolating from the current data that exists, what do you predict your likely preferred regimen will be? So same question as the first, except projecting into the future 3 to 5 years and extrapolating on the data that we currently have. So will your preferred regimen be number 1, moderate hypofractionation, number 2, 5-fraction whole breast radiation, or number 3, 5-fraction partial breast irradiation?
Actually, Beth, we removed conventional fractionation.
Right, right.
Yeah, it's only
That's great.
no conventional.
Okay, so we're gonna, I think we have enough of a signal here to show the trend. And so clearly we have
5 fractions.
trend moving
either
away.
Whole breast or PBI.
Right.
But 5 only.
So very interesting. Here's question number 3. What is the main obstacle towards performing partial breast irradiation for early stage breast cancer in the majority of patients? So number 1, limited evidence, so only for lower risk patients. Number 2, reimbursement. Or number 3, difficulty with follow-up. So if the patient had previous irradiation dealing with a failure. So very interested in your thoughts on this.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so I think we have a really good results here. So it looks like right now the evidence needs to be built up.
And it's only, we have it only for lower risk patients, so it's maybe the only scenario when you can use it.
Excellent. Okay, very informative. So question 4, I prescribe, I being you in the audience, I prescribe SBRT, so ultra or extreme hypofractionation, for treating prostate cancer in my practice. So we'd like to characterize what your prostate cancer treatment is, and specifically if you currently are prescribing ultra or extreme hypofractionation. You guys are very quick with the votes. This is fantastic. So
You know what they do.
here we go. So we're about 50-50%. So half of the audience is performing it, and the other half might think differently after Professor Van Os speaks.
Maybe they will change their mind.
And here's another question on that topic. Data regarding prostate SBRT, ultra or extreme hypofractionation for prostate cancer, has matured to a point where it is a standard of care for men with localized low, intermediate, or high-risk lymph node negative disease. So we'll wait for your polling results on this. All right, and we'll show the answer here. So obviously that's a very broad question, and in your minds you might have one of the risk stratification sort of cohorts that you're thinking of, but clearly a lot of excitement for some of the data that Professor Van Os will be showing. And then the last question. For prostate SBRT, ultra or extreme hypofractionation, my preferred treatment regimen is either A, LINAC-based SBRT with homogeneous dosing, B, CyberKnife-based SBRT with prescription to a lower isodose line, C, dose painting or simultaneous integrated boost to the dominant nodule with LINAC or CyberKnife radiation, or D, HDR brachy-like dosing.
This is a more technical one, and
Yes.
maybe people they don't do it, they don't answer. We'll see, but still a lot of answers.
So this is great.
A lot of people are voting.
So we have a really nice spread of answers, and we could get a good sense. It seems to be a lot of heterogeneity in how folks are treating prostate cancer. So this is wonderful.
So this was really interesting, and I hope that our speakers will discuss a little bit these results during their presentation. Then we'll have 10 minutes at the end, I hope, for a nice discussion. So let's start with the first presentation. Maria Cristina Leonardi will speak about hypofractionation in breast cancer from the CRYSTAL study with extreme hypofractionation to moderate hypofractionation. Cristina, the stage is yours.
Many thanks for the kind of presentation and for inviting me to give this talk about hypofractionation of breast cancer. Waiting for my slides. Okay. Where are we right now? We have been going on this long journey from conventional fractionation to ultra hypofractionation. Moderate hypofractionation is now considered the standard of care for whole breast radiotherapy, but it took about 10 years since the first publication of the START trials to arrive at this statement, and still there are some concerns about applying moderate hypofractionation to certain subgroups which are less represented in the pivotal trials. We need to be pragmatic and move on, because sometimes clinical routine runs faster than the trial results. Just think about ultra hypofractionation. The publication of the Fast Forward trial came at a time of great distress due to the pandemic. It was very welcome, but now, as it happened for moderate hypofractionation, needs time to mature and be digested. As a matter of fact, ultra hypofractionation has split the scientific community between a strong endorsement and lukewarm consensus calling for caution. Caution is dictated by the fact that 26 gray in 5 fraction means a reduction in 2 gray equivalent dose by about 10% when compared to 40 gray in 15 fraction, and by about 20% when compared to 50 gray in 25 fraction. The excellent results of the Fast Forward trial didn't show any impact of this lower dose on the trial population, which was mainly at low risk. Therefore, there might be any issues for those at high risk. On the other hand, if time factor is applied, 26 gray in 5 fractions would be more effective for local control, but somewhat worse for normal tissues effects. And here we come to the point of late toxicity. Overall, late toxicity was similar between 26 gray 5 fraction and 40 gray 15 fraction, with the exception of breast induration outside the tumor bed, which was statistically significantly worse for the 5 fractions. In addition, there are some uncertainties in the alpha-beta ratio. See the 95% confidence interval is very large, from 0.3 to 7.1. These uncertainties in the alpha-beta ratio have the largest impact on the ultra hypofractionated schedules, while being more limited for the moderate hypofractionation. On the other hand, it's also true that the absolute rate of moderate market dates in the Fast Forward trial was very low, and if these side effects are bound to increase over time, they will increase in both the treatment arms, possibly keeping a constant hazard ratio throughout the follow-up, as happened in the FAST trial and in START trial, so that the difference between the treatment arms will change little over time. But 5 fractions apart, let's take a look at some concerns which can affect the hypofractionation in general. Let's start with DCIS. The evidence is scarce. Most trials didn't include DCIS at all, and among them which did, only the Danish Hypo trial provided a subgroup analysis showing no difference in local control between the two types of fractionation and good local control indeed. There is just one dedicated phase 3 trial just published 1 year ago, showing comparing conventional versus hypofractionation and boost versus no boost, reporting no difference in toxicity and in local and ecological outcomes, and even a better quality of life in the hypofractionated arm. But in spite of this, just little over 50% of the Sangalian panelists this year are willing to offer moderate hypofractionation for DCIS patients, let alone ultra hypofractionation. Regarding nodal radiotherapy, although a minority of the patients enrolled in the START trials received the nodal radiotherapy, in the UK and some other countries, moderate hypofractionation is a standard of care. And also, is it possible to give a 5 fraction to frail patients under the umbrella of the nodal substudy? On the contrary, in the rest of Europe, moderate hypofractionation is accepted with caution. See the percentage of Sangalian panelists willing to offer moderate hypofractionations for nodal irradiation. The main concern is neurological toxicity, which is a legacy from the past when the higher dose per fraction were not adjusted with the total dose. But I think that in principle, I think that all of us agree on the safety of keeping the dose equivalent dose up to 50 gray. And in this respect, the hypofractionated schedules should raise no specific concern, except for the START A schedule, where, by the way, it was observed one plexopathy. On the other hand, because of the long latency from the end of radiotherapy to the onset of neurological symptoms, as long as 20 years or even more, and some uncertainties about the alpha-beta ratio for neurological toxicity, if we consider the worst case scenario with alpha-beta 1, you see that only the START B schedules is effective. Many of us require a longer follow-up before changing practice. With 5-year follow-up, we can rely on the Chinese trial where moderate hypofractionation was offered for local regional radiotherapy, reporting no difference in local control and no difference in toxicity, in particular no brachial plexopathy, a very, very low frequency of lymphoedema and shoulder problems. But the type of radiotherapy was basically bidimensional, mostly mainly using electrons. So organs at risk might have been spared from receiving a significant dose. And while we are still discussing if 40 gray is safe for nodal radiotherapy, waiting for the results of other trials to build a robust level of evidence and boost our confidence, the focus of attention has already moved on to the 26 gray in 5 fraction. And once again, clinical practice might run faster than clinical results. Regarding the incorporation of the booster in the hypofractionated settings, so far there have been a few few randomized trials published in full regarding the comparison between a sequential booster and a simultaneous integrated booster. So the fact that is that we don't have much data yet, and the general recommendation is to use a sequential booster. There is many reasons to favor SIB instead of a sequential booster in terms of shortening the overall treatment time, dose escalating to the tumor bed, and improving homogeneity. But we have to consider that treatment planning with SIB is a little more complex, and there is some concern regarding toxicity because of the higher fraction, the higher dose per fraction. If we look at the literature, only the MSC2 trial showed a worse acute toxicity in the SIB arm, but no difference in late toxicity in cosmetic outcome, and even a better quality of life at 2 years in the SIB arm. The SIB appeared not to be inferior to sequential booster for local control, but why should it be the opposite? And for dosimetrically reason, understandable reason, dosimetrically better. The incorporation of SIB in the 5 fraction schedules will be even more interesting to see, but for that we have to wait for the Hyport trial. There is a smaller randomized trial from Belgium published using SIB, but the endpoint was early toxicity, so maybe it's not the main endpoint for that. Regarding partial breast, there is a consensus on the use of both moderate and ultra hypofractionation, and a great interest in promoting IMRT. Now that the Choosing Wisely campaign withdraw the statement against the routine use of IMRT in breast cancer, acknowledging the benefit of improving dose conformity in order to irradiate as less as possible of the normal breast tissues. In fact, many trials have demonstrated a significant association between the relative volume of breast irradiated, the Dmax, the hotspots, and the risk of breast indulation and poor cosmesis. In addition, the Danish partial breast irradiation trial demonstrated that for same volume of the breast irradiated above a given dose, the frequency of breast indulation increases as the radiation dose increases. So it's very important to minimize hotspots. The dosimetric advantage of IMRT is particularly important for large breasts. Large breasts are rich in fat tissues and which have a higher intrinsic radiosensitivity, but beyond that, it's very important to minimize hotspots to improve homogeneity. And in this direction, many forms, all the forms of IMRT are very useful. Even a simple form of IMRT, field technique, can achieve superior cosmesis and make the hypofractionation safe and safer. With a view to sparing the normal tissues, the irradiation to the normal breast tissues in partial breast irradiation, the use of stereotactic partial breast irradiation with CyberKnife radiosurgery system is an option. In this study, the authors can apply a safer dose escalation from 30 to 40 gray fraction, thanks to the smaller treatment volume, the high conformality, and the steeper dose gradients. But how low can we go? We know that it's unlikely that 5 fraction represents the limit of hypofractionation, but why should we go any lower? Certainly not for local control and toxicity. See the excellent results on the fast-forward trial. Reason we can find in further reduce the department workloads and cost. Other reason can lie on searching the ablative effect, evaluating the immune response and the interaction with immunological therapies to increase the therapeutic ratio. There is a great interest in the ablative treatment, but for now this interest must be limited to scientific purpose and translational research. In our institution, we just completed a dose-finding study using CyberKnife, and now we are delivering 24 grain 1 fraction in a 2-phase study aiming at PCR. Our colleagues from the University of Florence have already adopted a similar scheme, delivering 21 grain single fraction with CyberKnife in the preoperative settings. I touched on various topics, but my presentation is coming to an end for the sake of time, so I would like to thank you for your interest and attention.
Thank you very much for your great overview. And now we move to the prostate cancer. So I invite Professor Manas to the stage. I expect many data here as well, a lot of news. And then we'll have discussion, so please prepare your questions. You can also send it by chat, but I think the room is not that big, so we can have just live discussion with the audience after the presentation. Please.
Hi, afternoon, everyone. I'm just waiting for the slides. Thanks to Accuray for the invitation. I've nothing on my screen. Thanks. Clearly a beginner. So what have we learned from PACE, a phase 3 randomized control trial? So by disclosures, I've had consulting fees from Accuray and speaker fees from Accuray and research grants from both Accuray and Varian. And actually the PACE trial wouldn't have happened without Accuray particularly, so thank you to them. So what is our current standard of care? Well, like in the breast cancer talk we just heard about, there are 4 large studies of moderate hypofractionation. And I was pleased to see that the UK is very well represented. And with the CHIP study, which was led by my colleague and mentor, David Dernley, and this study was for men with T1 to T3A prostate cancer. They received 3 to 6 months of hormones and had to have PSAs of less than 30. And they randomized to the then control arm, which was 74 gray in 37 fractions, and compared to both 60 gray in 20 fractions or 57 gray in 19 fractions. It was a very large study, 3,216 patients, median age of 69, and most of the patients were in the intermediate and high-risk cohort. And the study clearly demonstrated non-inferiority for the 60 gray. So this was non-inferior to the control arm. Important to note that the 57 gray was not non-inferior, so just 3 gray difference, and it didn't meet the non-inferiority. But 60 gray was non-inferior and is now our accepted standard of care in the UK. So what about the short-term side effects of this treatment? If you see these graphs, the top line is the grade 1 toxicity, the next 2 lines are the next 3 lines are the grade 2, and the very bottom lines are the grade 3, and the bowel on the left and the bladder on the right. And you can see quite a significant amount of grade 1 toxicity with this hyperfractionated arm coming on earlier, but ending up around about the same. And similarly with the bladder, peaks about the same, a little bit earlier for hyperfractionation. and relatively low rates of grade 2 and very low rates of grade 3 toxicity. And for late toxicity, a similar picture, really very acceptable and long-term low rates of low RTIG bowel toxicity. And similarly, the Lensong for the bladder. In fact, at 5 years, many patients reported better bladder outcomes than they had pre-treatment. But really, what we want to talk about is SBRT, and where are we with SBRT? So this is one of the studies with the longest follow-up. This is 10-year, this is 2 studies put together from Don Fuller and Bob Meyer, who were both really early pioneers of SBRT, both using the CyberKnife platform, Bob Meyer using a homogeneous planning, and Don Fuller using a heterogeneous sort of brachytherapy like dose plan. And they put their data together, and for the low-risk patients had outstanding 98.5% outcomes, 90.7% for the favorable intermediate risks, and then 75% for the unfavorable intermediate risks. But none of these patients received hormones, which many of us would believe would be standard of care for this cohort. There's also a long-term analysis conducted by Amar Kishan, and this is over 2,000 patients. Again, the majority of these patients were treated on the CyberKnife. Really, this is just because in the early days, most of the SBRT was delivered with CyberKnife, but now there are many people doing it on the LAC-VAS platforms. And again, this shows very, very favorable outcomes across the disease groups. This was really a seminal paper from Anders Widmark, who many of you will know has led some of the best studies in prostate cancer. This was the Hypo trial, which was ultra-hypofractionated, not by the classic definition, which is slightly arbitrary, of SBRT being 5 fractions or less. This was 7 fractions, but compared 78 gray and 39 fractions versus 42.7 gray in 7 fractions. And you can see that the curves are almost completely overlapping. The early bowel toxicity was very slightly worse with the ultra-hypofractionated regime, but again, when those lines cross, they tend to look like they're splitting again at the end, but you'll note at 10 years, there's very few patients out at that time point, so I don't think we can make any difference on that. And the urinary toxicity, the 2 regimes were almost identical and completely overlapping. So the PACE trial. So the PACE trial is an international randomized study of prostatectomy versus stereotactic body radiotherapy and conventional radiotherapy versus SBRT for early organ stage prostate cancer. It's a study that was run predominantly in the UK, but also in Canada and Ireland for PACE-B. PACE-A was almost entirely in the UK. So this is what the study looks like. So you have men with localized prostate cancer. Going down the left are the low intermediate risks. If they were a surgical consideration, they could go into the PACE-A arm, and they could randomize between prostatectomy and SBRT. If they weren't going for surgery, they went into PACE-B, and they'd randomize between conventional fractionation or SBRT. At the start, it was 78 gray. This changed after the CHIP study to 62 gray. And on the right-hand side is the PACE-C study, which is led by my colleague Alison Tree. This is for patients with slightly higher risk disease, the intermediate or high risks. The difference with this study is all the men get 6 months of ADT as planned, and otherwise it's very similar design to the PACE-B study. I won't be presenting any results of this yet because we don't have them, and I'll be showing you the PACE-B and the PACE-A results that we have to date. So the current status of the studies, PACE-A randomized 123 patients and it has closed, and I presented the results at GU ASCO this year, and I'll show them to you today. PACE-B has also closed, recruited 874 patients, and we've published the acute and the 2-year toxicity both in the Lancet Oncology. And PACE-C is close to recruitment, but we have not yet done any analysis on the trial. So this is the acute toxicity from PACE-B. So just a reminder, this was a randomized study between SBRT and conventionally fractionated radiotherapy. And the similar graphs to that showed you for the CHIP study. The top line is the grade 1 toxicity, which is actually lower than the CHIP study, but important that you shouldn't compare it across studies, rather compare it in this study, showing very little difference between the conventional and the hypofractionated regime. Then the next line, 2 lines down, are the grade 2, which you can see are almost entirely overlapping, and the grade 3, which runs along the 0 axis. So that's for GI. And for acute urinary toxicity, again, the top line, about 60% of men in both arms getting some grade 1 toxicity, about 21% getting grade 2 toxicity, and almost no one getting grade 3 toxicity. But more importantly, the 2-year toxicity. So this is what the study looked like. There were 320 men with grade 0 in the conventional arm and 299 with grade 0 in the SBRT arm. But importantly, low rates of grade 2 toxicity, 7 and 11, so 2% and 3%. For GI RTOG toxicity, again, there was no difference between these at rates of 2% in both arms. However, for CT CAE, this was more interesting. For GI, there was no difference, 4% and 3%. But for GU toxicity, there was a difference relative to this next slide. I'm missing a slide. For GU CTAC toxicity, there was a doubling from 6% to 12%, which you can see on these graphs in the visual form. Overall, bowel urinary bother, however, was very low. And we did a pre-planned analysis on CyberKnife versus Linac. So when the study started, all the patients were treated on CyberKnife. And then when we opened the study up to other platforms, we planned to compare these two. Now, this is important, it's not randomized, but it was a pre-planned analysis. So there was no difference in the RTOG genitourinary toxicity or the arterial toxicity. But for CTAC toxicity, there was a difference with 6% in the CyberKnife arm and 17% in the Linac arm. And similarly, there was also a difference in the GI grade 2 toxicity. We're not entirely sure exactly why this occurs. We think there's probably multifactorial. The CyberKnife centers were large, high-volume experience centers. I do think that the real-time tracking makes a difference, and potentially the non-complainant treatment may make a difference. But I think what it importantly shows is that the quality of the delivery of your SBRT does really matter. And high-quality SBRT can be definitely as good in terms of toxicity profile as conventionally fractionated radiotherapy. So this is just looking at it graphically. So it's 16% versus 16.5 versus 5.8%, which was highly statistically significant. And this is for the GI, non-significant, but an absolute difference of 5.2 to 0.6. So what about the PACE-A trial? So this was a very difficult study to run, randomized between surgery and SBRT. The original idea in 2007 this was the battle of the robots. We felt that we had two highly advanced technical ways of treating cancer. For treating prostate cancer, many men were starting to be offered the Da Vinci robot, which I think would now be considered almost standard of care for the surgical management of prostate cancer. And CyberKnife was an evolving technology. The study randomized 1-to-1 between surgery and SBRT. We had originally planned to recruit up to 800 patients, but it became clear we would never achieve that, so we reevaluated the study and decided to have primary endpoints, which were toxicity. So we had co-primary endpoints, urinary incontinence, defined by the number of absorbent pads required per day, and epic bowel bother. So we expected that urinary incontinence would probably be worse with surgery, and we thought that bowel bother would be worse with SBRT. So we wanted to have these co-primary endpoints as to not to bias one against the other. And there were a number of secondary outcomes, which are listed below. So we aimed to recruit 234 patients, and that would have given us a 90% power to detect the difference in epic bowel bother. And we expected that 15% of the surgery patients would have problems, would be wearing pads, and about 4% with SBRT. We recruited up to 123, and then what happened when COVID hit, literally prostatectomies in the UK almost stopped completely, and for a 2-year period we actually recruited no patients. The IDMC then looked at the data, and we asked should we carry on, and they'd obviously seen the data, and you're about to see it, and they said there was no point in continuing. we've already had significant results, and we wouldn't benefit from recruiting any more patients. So this trial was stopped at 123, and this will look like there were 60 patients in the surgery arm, 63 in the SBRT arm. Important to note that most of these patients were intermediate risk, so about 92% were intermediate risk. We don't tend to treat low-risk patients in the UK. They get managed with active surveillance. That's the consort diagram. As you can see, there were some crossovers, and then the bottom line are the numbers who were analysed, 46 including the analysis for surgery and 56 for SBRT. So the results, the proportion of patients were in urinary pads at 2 years. For surgery, it was 46.8%, and for SBRT, it was 4.5%. So this was highly statistically significant. That's what it looks like over time. You can see at each time point, there are a significant number more men wearing pads following surgery than there are following SBRT. It is important to note that people were only tending to wear one pad. The majority of people were wearing one pad, so many of the people who had surgery were wearing a pad for security. When I presented this, there was quite a lot of Twitter activity about this. The urologist saying, oh, this is just men wearing one pad, it doesn't matter. And the feedback from the oncologist was, I don't wear a pad, do you? So I think wearing one pad does matter. For bowel bother, so this is an EPIC score, so the maximum you can achieve is 100, so 100 is perfect. So surgery was 97.3 and SBRT was 88.7, which was significant. And that's, again, what it looks like over the time periods. Again, important to note that what bowel bother actually meant. So people who had no problem were the highest proportion in both. A very small problem, again, so most people who had a bowel bother with SBRT reported a very small problem, others a small problem, one patient a moderate problem, and no patients a big problem. So although it is statistically significant, the bowel bother was fairly minor. So sexual function, EPIC bowel bother, so I'm not sure why, if you can read that, that's very faint on my screen. Again, it's an EPIC score, which is best is 100. For surgery was 29.3, and for SBRT, 57.7, and again, this was significant. And that's what this looks like graphically. So you can see at the start of the treatment, a significant number of men were already having some impairment of their sexual function. There's a very big dip after surgery with some recovery, but it doesn't get anywhere back to the baseline. SBRT, again, there is some dip, but it gets closer to baseline. And those are the other EPIC subdomains shown graphically. So we also recorded CTA toxicity, and there was really no difference across the study. This is for GI. I think this is really important. If we hadn't done the patient-reported outcome, we would have missed the really big differences that I've just shown you. If we'd only done clinician-reported outcome, we'd have seen no difference. Similarly with GU toxicity, absolutely no difference between the two at 2 years. So I think one of the big learning points was the patient-reported is really what counts. So our conclusions were, compared with surgery, patients receiving SBRT reported better urinary incontinence and less sexual bother at 2 years. The SBRT reported worse bowel bother at 2 years. Grade 2 CTAC was very rare in both arms, and the efficacy data of this trial will be presented later. And the efficacy data for PACE B, the IDMC are in the process of looking at the data, and we do expect it to be presented later this year, but I can't give a date yet. So what about the future? So the next PACE trial is called PACE Nodes. So this is in the higher risk cohort, so patients with high risk disease, and they're going to randomize to receive SBRT to the prostate alone or SBRT to prostate and nodes, receiving 20 gray, 5 gray to the nodes. So this study is now up and running, and it's been led by my colleagues Angela Pathanathan and Sunil Jain. That's the design. It's a phase 3 randomized with the primary aim of determining whether treating the nodes of an SBRT to prostate alone would improve biochemical and clinical failure. Aims to recruit 536 patients. It is up and running and recruitment is going well. I'm just going to fly through the similar primary endpoints to what we've presented elsewhere. and similar eligibility. The other issue is how low can we go, similar concept to what we heard in the breast fractionation talk. And Alison, who is, I think, in the audience, is leading the Hermes study, which is a 1-to-1 randomization. Group 1 getting 5 fraction SBRT, and Group 2 getting 2 fraction SBRT. This is all being done on an MR-Linac, and it's also going very well. I think it will be close to finishing relatively soon. So I think that's where we are, and we are at very interesting discussions with some colleagues last night who are in the process of trying to design the next study for so low and intermediate risk prostate cancer. So exciting times ahead, and watch this space.
Excellent presentation. So please, Dr. Leonardi, please come here to the stage, don't mind. And there's time for discussion. We're perfectly on time. We have 12 minutes left, so I expect quite many questions. Obviously, we have some, but the audience has the priority. We have also one question from the chat, but how many people can see? Maybe we first.
Sure. So here's our first question, and this question is for Professor Van Osp. Is the PTV margin between Linac-based and CyberKnife the same for prostate radiation in the PACE-B trial?
What margin?
Is the PTV margin between the Linac-based and CyberKnife-based treated the same?
No, they weren't completely the same, actually. So the CyberKnife was 5 and 3. It was basically between maximum of 1 for the whole prostate, and then 6 millimeters down to 4 millimeters for the Linac. So you had some flexibility with what you could do with the Linac, so they weren't quite the same.
Okay. And despite the same margins, the toxicity was different between Cyber and Linac, yes?
So it's important to say that the conventionally fractionated Linac was also, the CyberKnife looked very, very similar to the conventionally fractionated Linac, which was a little bit better. What we didn't, what was odd was that it was different in the SBRT. There are some other things in the SBRT Linac-based treatment. There were 2 large volume centers that reported quite a lot of higher toxicity. We don't really know why, experienced centers. So I think there were some confounding factors. What was interesting is it was consistent in the acute and late toxicity. So, I think there's something there, but it's hard to distinguish exactly what it is.
Very interesting observation from the study. Okay, any other comments or questions?
So we have another one from the audience, and folks, please feel free just to log in your questions in the chat area, and we could ask them to our speakers. So this question is: does the use of anticoagulant impact the choice of hypofractionation?
Prostate.
It's unclear, so I think perhaps we should ask both our speakers.
I don't think it really does. I mean, there is literature suggesting people on anticoagulants have a higher rate of toxicity. I'm not sure that the particular anticoagulant is relevant.
And Dr. Leonardi, any thoughts on whether anticoagulation matters for?
Is the same one? Okay.
And so this next question, Dr. Leonardi, is for you from the audience. And the question is, in breast cancer, we need long-term data for extreme hypofractionation. And so the question posed is, do we have 10, 15, or 20-year follow-up on data?
For the hypofractionation, yes, the problem is we have just 5 years follow-up of the fast-forward trial. We have, of course, 10 years follow-up in the fast trial. The design was a little different, 1 fraction weekly for 5 weeks. But But the point is that for the first trial, the main endpoint was not local control, but was toxicity, was cosmetic outcome. So we lack this very important endpoint for the first trial, which, by the way, had 10 years follow-up. So for a wider implementation of the 5 fraction in 1 week, I think we need time. I think the trial was very outstanding. It will be practice changing, but we'll have to give time to it.
Dr. Leonardi, so you support the policy by NCCN. They state that it's too early to use it as a routine, while in the UK it is from 15 October 2020, it's a new standard. Yeah, so you are more for cautious approach.
It's true. But we are still struggling on applying moderate hypofractionation for all the situations. So I think that it's a giant leap to go to 5 fraction when we have to settle things with the moderate hypofractionation. So settle first moderate hypofractionation, then move on. But we will arrive at 5 fraction. I am sure about that. So will be the next future.
There's one more question for Dr. Leonardi. Is there any evidence to give 5 gray in 5 fractions as a boost after 26 in 5?
No, there is not yet. Just I mentioned the only randomized trial, very small randomized trial from Belgium, 2,000 patients enrolled. But the end point was very early toxicity, so side effects at 4 weeks after radiotherapy. This is not the point. We know that echotoxicity is lower, but we are very interested to see how late toxicity will go. So no, we don't have data yet, and yeah. It's not safe.
Something, because you try to give 5 fraction short treatment and then you give the same duration, so it's double time, double duration, 5 plus 5 days. So you also lose the benefit of extreme hypofractionation. It becomes almost like moderate 2 weeks treatment. So I think that we don't have evidence, and actually it's not a very good concept also from the overall treatment time aspect. We have one more question to Professor Van As.
So Professor Van As, and this question highlights one of the polling questions that we asked. So this is from one of our colleagues in the United Kingdom. If there's now a trial comparing 2 fractions with 5 fractions for prostate cancer, does this mean that 5 fractions can be considered standard of care?
Question. What is the standard arm?
So yeah, it's a good question. So I don't think you can say 5 fractions is standard of care at the moment. It's because we haven't presented the results of the Phase B study, which we will present, and I think we are preparing the ground for it being standard of care in the UK. It isn't currently standard of care. So yeah, I should bring Alison up to answer whether or not she should be doing the 2 fraction study yet then. But no, I mean, I think it's a really interesting study, but the patients obviously consented to the fact that standard of care is 20 fractions. There's a lot of data, I think, internationally to say 5 fractions is safe. We know it's safe. We've seen the toxicity data. There's a lot of outcome data on non-randomized, but a lot of outcome data on 5 fractions. So I don't think there's any ethical issue really of running a 5 versus 2.
Okay, and I think now it's one of the last questions for Dr. Leonardi. Fast forward, local control curves looked like they might be separating in favor 26 in 5. To believe we need 10 or, do you believe, and this is the question, we need 10 or 15-year data before changing practice, means those curves might flip around. Do you agree that this is unlikely? So it is the question about the prevision, how the curves will go. I don't know. You maybe predict.
It's very difficult to say about that.
Yeah, it's a tricky question because actually, sometimes there are some surprise with curves, so we don't know it yet. We wait.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's at the moment, for the time being, I think it's, I agree with the Sandhagen panelists, which cannot endorse right now the 5 fraction right away. I think we need time, the trial population was mainly at little risk. Most of these patients can receive a partial breast irradiation. Maybe we have just little more data on partial breast irradiation because more 9,000 patients were enrolled in a randomized study. So we have a lot of patients and also longer follow-up. Maybe if a patient is suitable for partial breast irradiation, I think that she should receive a partial breast irradiation following the principle of the minimum effective treatment. Otherwise, if the patient doesn't meet at least one criteria for the low risk, you can offer 5 fraction. You can discuss with the patients about the pro, the contra, the 5 fraction for what we know right now. And for the future, we can't say anything.
Wonderful. So we have time for a final question.
Thank you. Just coming back to the standard of care for prostate cancer. So I'm from a non-academic centre in the UK. We did contribute to the PACE trial, and we've adopted our standard of care, low and intermediate risk. I think there's a huge amount of data, from North America showing safety. And I think the other thing is, if you're looking at low and intermediate risk prostate cancer, the men are highly unlikely to ever die from this disease. So in terms of the risks, they're extremely low, and compared to the CHIP trial, we know that even though there are some slight toxicity concerns, they are slight. So I think in terms of resource implications from a pragmatic perspective, I'm very happy to accept it as a standard of care prematurely and fully support Alison's trial. So I've got no problem with it whatsoever. So I think we should be pushing it, and it's ultimately going to happen. I hope I'm not wrong, because I look very silly otherwise. But I'm happy to stand up and make that point.
Thank you. It won't be the first time it looks silly, but that's
Thank you.
On behalf of Accuray, we'd love to have just a moment of a round of applause for our co-chair and for our speakers. Of course, we would also like to thank you for your attendance and look forward to further conversations. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Have a nice afternoon.
Yeah. Thank you.